All right, so the violent settler colonial regime that we call the State of Israel is back at it again, this time cracking down on Palestinian human rights groups that are trying to hold the State of Israel accountable for their human rights abuses. And so we got some great reporting here from The Intercept's Robert Mackey on this entire story. It is absolutely wild, and you are going to see why in a second here. So Palestinian rights groups that document Israeli abuses are labeled terrorists by Israel, and Israel designated 6 leading Palestinian human rights groups terrorist organizations, but refused to reveal any evidence to prove the accusation. Okay, this is a very key part of this entire story, right? They have not provided a single lick of evidence to actually back up the assertions that they are leveling, as we are about to get into here. But understand, first and foremost, okay, I've talked about this concept multiple times on this channel repeatedly, but terrorist is an entirely subjective term that empires, whether it's the United States or our various military bases like the State of Israel, all of these different labeling of terrorist organizations, it's entirely subjective, right? People who live in Afghanistan who have experienced multiple decades of bombing by the American government would probably call the US military terrorist organizations, okay? And so all of this labeling of terrorism is basically just a political tool that different governments around the world use in different situations to suit whatever their national security interest happens to be at that particular moment. So understand that first and foremost, there is no objective definition of the word terrorism as it is used typically in a foreign policy sense. So that's first and foremost. But now let's get into the actual details of this particular story. So an order signed by Israel's defense minister on Friday designated 6 leading Palestinian human rights groups, quote, terrorist organizations, marking an escalation in Israel's effort to deprive independent agencies that document Israeli military abuses in the occupied territories of funding from U.S. Foundations and European nations. And also understand, right, from the perspective of Palestinians who are living under this brutality from the State of Israel, okay? In many cases, the IDF and Israel's military themselves, they are the terrorists, okay? Just in this last recent bombing campaign of Gaza that we saw earlier in 2021, okay? They killed dozens and dozens of innocent children. They blew up the AP building. They were bombing hospitals and other facilities, refugee camps, okay? What do you call that other than terrorism, okay? That is terrorism. But again, it's an entirely subjective word that is used in many different contexts. And of course, Israel would never admit that they themselves are guilty of terrorism, even though by any attempt at an objective definition, they would be far more or far greater and more effective terrorists than Hamas or any of these other organizations that they label as terrorists themselves. But they continue saying that Israeli law criminalizes providing funds to groups designated as terrorist organizations and authorizes the police to, quote, prevent activities by or in support of terrorist organizations, including organizing meetings, marches, or training. So now not only will these organizations not be able to get funding from abroad, but they will also face increased escalation from the Israeli security forces within the Palestinian occupied territory. So this is really nothing but an attempt to shut down any organizations that are attempting to hold the State of Israel accountable for their crimes that they are committing, okay? And so they continue here saying that because the Israeli agencies said the designations were based on secret evidence that was, quote, concealed for security reasons, the rights groups were given no opportunity to rebut an accusation that struck their many international and Israeli partners as transparently false. So again, I mean, listen, they're not even bothering to give bullshit evidence to justify the accusations that they are leveling here, okay? They're just completely making it up out of whole cloth for however much we know, right? Because they're not giving us any information on this. So what are we to believe other than that they are just completely arbitrarily designating them as terrorist groups in order to try to shut down any accountability for the State of Israel? I mean, that is really the only fair conclusion that you can draw from an action like this. If you are not going to provide any public evidence to back up your accusations, then your accusations can be dismissed out of hand, okay? And we know this obviously given the context of what Israel has been trying to do recently, but they continue here giving a little bit more context as to who specifically is being targeted by this, saying that the rights activists branded terrorists by the defense minister Benny Gantz work on a range of uniformly peaceful civil society projects to improve life in the occupied territories run by Israel's military, and the 6 groups are Defense for Children International Palestine, which defends Palestinian children in Israeli military courts and has documented abuses and killings by Israeli forces, Al-Haq, which documents violations of Palestinians' rights in the West Bank and in an affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva, and Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, which advocates for Palestinian political prisoners held in Israeli and Palestinian prisons, and the Union of Agricultural Work Committees and Agricultural Development Group, the Bison Center for Research and Development, an academic institute whose Ramallah offices were raided by Israeli security forces in July, and the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees, a rights group, a women's women's rights group organizations. So you see, they are really just trying to target every single human rights group that is working on the ground to try to defend Palestinians from the increasing escalation by Israeli security forces as they continue this settler colonial project that they are embarking on. And so this is obviously just ridiculous at face value, okay? Again, they don't even bother to provide bullshit evidence, let alone any evidence whatsoever, to the public so that we could even check or try to get some sort of an actual idea of what the accusation actually is, okay? They're just labeling them as terrorist organizations in the same way that the Trump administration labeled Antifa and BLM terrorist organizations last year in the wake of those protests, okay? This is what happens when fascist regimes are faced with justified pushback against their actions, okay? They're just going to turn around and try to suppress any groups that are trying to defend the people that are put in the position that they have been put in, like Palestinians have been by the state of Israel. And so we have had some pretty swift condemnation for these actions from Israel, okay? We had multiple human rights groups speaking out against this. Israel-Palestine designation of Palestinian rights groups as terrorists, you see here from Human Rights Watch and other organizations. They say the designation made pursuant to a 2016 Israeli statute effectively outlaws the activities of these civil society groups. It authorizes Israeli authorities to close their offices, seize their assets, and arrest and jail their staff members. And it prohibits funding or even publicly expressing support for their activities. And they say, quote, this appalling, and this is from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and they say this appalling and unjust decision is an attack by the Israeli government on the international human rights movement. For decades, Israeli authorities have systemically sought to muzzle human rights monitoring and punish those who criticize its repressive rule over Palestinians. And while staff members of our organizations have faced deportation and travel bans, Palestinian human rights defenders have always borne the brunt of the repression. And the decision has an alarming escalation that threatens to shut down the work of Palestine's most prominent civil society organizations, and the decades-long failure of the international community to challenge grave Israeli human rights abuses and impose meaningful consequences for them has emboldened Israeli authorities to act in this brazen manner. And we have seen this even just recently with some members of the squad trying to push back on some of this funding that was supposed to be going towards the Israel's Iron Dome, which really it wasn't for Israel's Iron Dome. But we've been having a little bit of legislative pushback, and even that is very greatly dwarfed by the size of the pro-Israeli lobbying influence within the U.S. government. And so frequently all of these attempts to legislatively push back against the crimes of Israel are immediately suppressed by some of these pro-Israel corrupted government officials, basically. But we have some that are speaking out against this action. So we have Rashida Tlaib here, okay? The apartheid regime's labeling of award-winning human rights groups as terrorist organizations just because they speak truths about Israel's violence and its human impact is grossly anti-democratic and dangerous. The U.S. must end funding for human rights abuses, and she is absolutely right. We should not be giving billions of dollars a year in not just funding, but also military aid directly to an apartheid government that is committing war crimes with the weapons that we are giving them. That should be very obvious, I think. And Ilhan Omar also came out here condemning this, saying that labeling effective NGOs as terrorists is a textbook way to evade accountability for human rights violations and an affront to everyone who cares about peace. There must be immediate consequence from the U.S. and international community for this brazen act. And listen, I mean, both of them, that's, to say the least, okay? This situation is absolutely ridiculous, but it's not anything that would be too unexpected from the state of Israel, okay? This is a government that increases their settler colonial violence as time goes on. It seems like there is absolutely no accountability that they will ever be facing for this, at least not as our current government is made up here in the United States. We continue to sell weapons to human rights abusers, whether it's Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia, or a host of a number of other countries that we sell weapons to and give unconditional support for Israel. But understand the actual reason for why they are doing this is not, to push back against so-called terrorism against the state of Israel. It's not in their own national security interests. It's really for two main reasons. And those two main reasons are, one, to silence anybody who is trying to hold the state of Israel accountable for the crimes that they are committing against Palestinians, especially in occupied Palestinian territories. And two is to make sure that they put a complete and utter stranglehold on any resources that are to be given to people who are living in the world's largest open-air prison in Gaza, or Palestinians who are facing increased settler violence in the West Bank. So those are really the main purposes of what this action is actually for. And yet we are going to have to wait and see if the U.S. government is going to actually do literally anything to push back against this. And honestly, my hope for that is waning and pretty little.